All right, part 4, technical problems. So next phase is we go into this very strange area that is the world's largest apple orchard. There's all these creepy houses scattered everywhere there, dirt roads, a community of workers, these slave houses, and a storage stone building that was like 2 stories high, plus a cold storage house unit. This was in the Castle Crashers string-lined events where we were all being stalked from castle to castle, chased from place to place sometimes, coming through different doors of different castles in what we called the Dark Ages or the medieval times. What we did at this point in the Time Wars was we called it the Castle Law Domain Game Rules. So in the Castle Crashers events, we would have graffiti tags in many places that are still left in many places, and it would say just Castle Law on it, things to remind us of these times. So when we went to this one particular place with all these little hills and valleys, me and John saw many things wrong here. At this point, this had nothing to do with Solar Warden. Solar Warden was already dismantled and disassembled and destroyed. These assignments were sent from a benevolent faction that had nothing to do with Solar Warden. So we went into this valley. We saw people were being treated very badly. You could just know the stench in the air was like reptilian type activity was going on at night. And what happens is that with the spirits that do body jumping and piggybacking and consciousness, streamlining, and all the techniques that they use to continue to have themselves tethered here and in the tangibility to be able to continue to do the sins that they enjoy doing and committing and getting the family unit to stay generationally cursed with them and to be on board with them. They act as like a horcrux. There's always one spirit at the top of the head of all of these family archetypes. And that's why generational curses really do need to be broken off. And the only thing that breaks all of those off and all of those chain links is the blood of the Messiah. So we go into this place at night. There's a big stone mansion with a tower down the road. This has a big steel fence going into the grass and stone walls above that, all above the grounds. So there's one main mansion type area, and then down the hill, there's all these other different various areas. So there's buildings, of course, with the heavy, thick moss, black, green moss covering them, like almost like hedge mazes around the place. So we navigate around here. We see a man in a house with his family that has like really dark, deep set, shifty, shady eyes. And when he speaks, we immediately recognize who the spirit is because you recognize spiritual signatures and energy traces that are easy to pick up when there's no like AI backing overly components to them. Usually it's easier. And then you just, because the air is clear to see that. So this guy has a long black beard and bushy beard. He's got a shaved head, wears black suit and a hat, looks pretty ragged. So we recognize the spirits from the times of the castle crasher days. So we go into the house one night, follow him, we see him shift, and he recognizes us, and then he tries charging at us because he hated us when he recognized us. So we follow this man again to a different house path to see what's going on. And what happens is that we see the same type of activity. There's hidden body parts in the cold storage locker units in this rotting house. And that acted as kind of like a refrigeration unit back in that time period. So basically, we're seeing the same types of behaviors, trying to go from different and stay in different family lines. These people and spirits and bodies they inhabit continue to want to do their blood eating behaviors. They want to continue to have the line of the pedivore Babylonian type mentality stay within certain family rings. So that's why there was all these, random slave houses everywhere throughout this place. And then they ran trafficking rings using the railroad system that was right next to this huge apple storage shed stone building. And a lot more things were moved in that train railroad place because it was positioned right next to what we called the Apple Castle. This wasn't just like a regular apple storage shed. This thing was built like it was like a big stone castle in itself, and the spirit there was very territorial, and we later on recognized that it was the spirit of Rasputin who was there, and it drives out anyone who doesn't cooperate with this trafficking train system, smuggling type thing, activities that they always do. It's just the same type of things that they do. And a lot of the buildings that you come back to, they're like, half stone buildings left there, and then these like little red bricks that look like tally marks on the edges of them, the way they're designed. So we'd label things like that we'd see, like Monster Red Tally Mark House and Monster Lane or something, to come back at a later time, save that imprint pattern, and then we could go back to certain places, touch certain spots, and download information by touching certain objects. So at the end of this whole ordeal in the Brookline and the slave trade train system, apple shed stone building, it all came crumbling down. This castle apple storage place, okay, it had huge walls, these big wooden doors, brass and iron that swung open, and we called it the Apple Castle, or the castle creature, or the apple orchard, because Rasputin thought it was like probably the next best thing to a castle that he could, or like a lair that he could hold on to, the only thing worth having in this time period, I guess, near some woods and that train. So he was fighting us in there at the end. His death trail stopped. The walls ended up breaking up. The roof got taken off, and it was a disaster and in shambles by the time we left. The entrances were blocked, sunken in, dilapidated, looking stone walls. One wall completely fell down and is laying in like the grass area. One opening has this big metal X on it, and the archways are still standing though. But the funny thing is that the occult worship this character Rasputin, but he was not as powerful as what they prop him up to be. Like he would mutter these things and like walk funny and try to curse us really chaotically and fastly, talking in different language. So he just kind of looked like a fool to us because he really despised us for defeating so many things in these processes that we had success in, because they wished to continue their works and their dark arts, and a lot of times they get stopped and prevented from doing so. So at the very end of this, we'd go into the big stone building castle area, storage place, and he would sense us in certain areas is what happened. And what he would do is he would try like charging at us. It looked like he was almost foaming at the mouth frantically, because he'd just like try to run at us chaotically and look all flustered and outraged, blah, 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 talking in his different language. So he was carrying this big wooden pail of apples is what happened at the very end. And he comes down from the very top wooden steps at the top of this whole storage apple unit. And he was thinking he was going to rush down the steps while like chaotically muttering these insane quick curses at us in another language as fast as he could. Like he was really going to get us that time finally. But I mean, he just kind of sounded like a monster, tripping over his own tongue, tripping over his own feet, literally. So he ends up falling down the steps, slipping on his apple bucket, and then landing on his head, and his neck was all broken, twisted. So it was quite a sight, because the end of that was that he was literally laying in piles of rotten fruit, because these people are rotten fruit. All the storage shelf units got knocked down, 3 stories high. It was like a whirlwind of apples, and in the Rasputin beatdown in this dilapidated, damaged apple castle that all came crashing down, and he's laying in a pile of like the floor covered in rotten fruit. So we got to see firsthand, like some of these magicians are very quick to act, quick to think that they can just quickly blind or curse anybody. And we saw firsthand that pride comes before the fall. And he literally fell right in front of us down a huge set of wooden steps on an apple bucket on top of his head, and ends up cursing himself, tripping all over his own apples, and laying on the floor buried in rotten fruit in front of us. So that was the legacy that he left behind, and the last thing that he clutched onto in these that world was diminished, along with a lot of other old diminished worlds. and that spirit of slavery again was lifted. And the power plays that happen with these generational curses and spirits. Like I said, every family has one head one that's like a chief that tries to come in and continue to do its works inside of family units and dominating as a spirit for a number of generations as a stronghold. So it's just another useless beast. So me and John after that ended up just going down on the railroad tracks and and laughing about the situation. I was like rolling around laughing so hard I like cut my knees up on the railroad track. So a lot of these memories and things that we saw firsthand, it's like they can't all be unrepressed and like unzipped all at the same time, because that was shown to us in like celestial mechanics type of pattern, because it would be too much sometimes for one body, one personality, one person have it all come out at once. So sometimes things like these events had to be concealed for a later time and information packages to be revealed at a later time in a more orderly fashion, so it's not chaotic and it can be a unified and uniform waveform in which it comes out like in an accordion that's clipped shut to open up again in its fullness at a later time, and then it makes a pleasant note at that time release, time locked sensitivity, so that it's able to stay open fully, because it can help others then and not be harmful to others. So the thing with Interstellar movie is that we're made of interstellar material ourselves, and the universe is made of the same type of interstellar material. And there's radiant energy that swallows up other energy like a boundary, that swallows up fallen stars, even like a black hole. And then there's radiation jets in space and interstellar material everywhere. And it gives us kind of a window to see about how we operate inside too, and our internal structures and our innermost parts. And how the heavenly garments are knitted inside of us as our innermost parts. A lot of interstellar material can swallow up and capture stars even, and that's called the singularity, which happens in the middle of a black hole. Now, event horizons are the threshold of no escape, that point of no return, and then outside of them lies an accretion disk on its edges and borders. So it's like a paradoxical point. And then voids are empty, chaotic spaces like Tiamat was. And there's a book called The Guidebook of the Elect, and it says in space, there's no up or down, everything's circumventional, so to speak. And the bending of space and time are the appearance of the points to infinity, how it would gravitate towards curving into like a funnel shape, like a triangle pointing to a more sophisticated shape that it's bending into and wanting to combine itself into, because everything's longing for completion. It says the garment of creation is even wearing itself out. So refracting light happens here in those funnel points in space and space-time anomalies, and then refracting light from an exterior source comes out that's integral to its own existence. It refracts those points and nodal points in time and space, refract light from an exterior source integral to its own existence, and reference points. So there's also universal infinitesimal boundaries like a sea, and then what we see that is in the study and research of quantum foam. So quantum foam, I believe, rests below the firmaments, below the sea of glass and fire. And then there's the firmament of water above, which is outside of time and space. And then below that, there are positions and appointments, allotments, and appointed things that have to stay there. Stationary measures set everywhere. The storehouses of hail and snow reserved for the last days, and then the angels that guard all of those things. And they mingle with the other angels who hold other vast majestic elements at bay. Like there's even an angel that holds the dew of resurrection and plays with that dew of resurrection as a job. What a fascinating job that would be. So the good thing about surviving the time travel program is that we got to see the base, lower, fallen entity type reptilian things. But on the flip side, on the other side of the end of the spectrum, we got to see the celestial beings too that pulled us through and up and out of that. And behind these beings' heads is like another world of light comes out and shines out from behind their heads. Like something opens up behind their heads that you can't fully see the fullness of yet, just a portion of, a partition of. So they have this countenance and a crown and a portal that we can't even see or fathom yet, because uh, because there's a lot of friction that comes with our carnal flesh and with our blood, and it would cause these schisms and friction if we go into higher states of particle angular rate of spin and stuff to try to have like a Merkaba field that would try to enter heaven. It can't happen yet because we're still anchored here in the physical. So we only see portions of things. Beyond the sun is where these beings carry their light from, because the light isn't even from this world, it's from the kingdom that is not of this world. So in our meetings and points in time, in the time wars that we got to actually see the Messiah himself, Yahushua, he would tell us things that were integral to our existence, like we were his children sitting there, and he was speaking to us through his eyes, even what we needed to do, who we were, especially in the future, and then what he set and put each one of us into existence for to do, and what we meant to him. So those were high moments of clarity, and we had a connection with him. So our information was highly coveted and guarded, and sometimes it actually had to be shifted, and us shifted out of time and space from the stalking fields to be able to have these like meetings with higher beings, so that we weren't traced, and it was kept away from like spying and prying and the devil's informant's eyes, basically. So in certain times in the time wars, we were like aeronaut arcs, Torah arcs. The things we experienced were also written into the Torah codes themselves, like the Joplin tornado and other events in time. So throughout the chaos that happened, we had to stabilize matters of indifference. Adiaphora. So being in one body could have rendered us insane, because we had moments where we had to deal with like a spirit of insanity or a spirit of suicide. And with all the mind wipes, it was especially hard. And then the only thing that pulled us through is remembering a connection with that higher source, and then having that true love and light of life come flooding into you and set you back on your path again. So at times we felt very incompetent to continue to do the things that we did, but we were at each level prepared to enter into the next level, and then to protect and defend bodies more fervently, and be able to be devoted to protecting other groups of children and other groups of souls. And it became more of a selfless mission at certain points. So by the time we already had gotten to Montauk in Long Island, we had already been skilled in how to deal and navigate through multiple situations and strategic warfare, and especially with the lingering spearhead of the Nazi time wars energy, that black sun, that black fool energy, because we had already encountered it several times previous to being placed at Montauk, Long Island, and all the scrambling that tried to go on there, and all the biohacking that tried to go on there, and all the soul and spirit fragmentation that they tried to mete out on everybody there. So we already had advancements in how these systems came in here into these realities and dimensions and realms, and how they infected things like parasites and viruses, and then how to work through them, uproot them, and detangle ourselves through them without getting lost in the maze, of course, or going falling privy and prey to them, and keeping our composure and spiritual integrity, and recognizing their shadows and whose faces were in these shadow type governments and the heads of them. It was like a 5D chess game, which is still going on today, encoded in the Torah codes, 9/11 being like the first demolition that was seen in the major public zones. Before this, though, we saw a mini 9/11 that was like a demolition, same very fast crashing down of the building in that was called the Keystone Lodge in Joplin. So there was many legions. We'd already seen many different types of ancient Masonic orders that we had already fought and dealt with, many posts of darkness, and Lucifer's commands, his headquarters, his legions that he sends out. But then on the flip side, we got to see the 177th Legion of Light, Yahweh's light, from the house of Jehovah, where other light beings are stationed too, that completely can come in and just override any of those areas and any of those other dark legions. So they invert a lot of names too, like Siloam, because Siloam meant like a healing waters in Bethsaida in biblical times, and looking glass technology, which mocks the Messiah who walks on the vaults of heaven and the sea of glass and fire. The angels also view the earth through this type of means and peer through multiple realities and dimensions at once. And that's why we saw the flip side of that also in the fallen angels' eyes that looked like dark cybernetic astrolabes that had some like unholy fire behind them. So you didn't want to get like tranced out or mesmerized by their eyes, because their eyes also made sounds. And these sounds are carryovers also from other planets and planetary realms that they come through, because every planet has like a recording, like Saturn's rings has a recording and other things. They can emit that actually from their eyes and their astrolabe type cybernetic eyes. So it's like a geometric pattern that comes out of their eyes. So we'd see vantage points, we'd hear from heavenly councils, how the ends of times and ends of ages worked, and things that were foreseen, and then how things would get unfrayed at the endpoints, and then how to carry ourselves to those endpoints without getting memory or mind wiped again. But we knew that in the end, all things would be unraveled in the end of times and ages, and that all things would be revealed. That there is an end to these things, these massive and major types of evil, the energies that got stacked up against the world, stacked up against places, and stacked up against us. So when the energies get sucked out of like architecture, say out of like mansions or walls or major points that are mansion rings of networks that use buildings for energy harvesting, we actually see those types of energies and beings and demonic forces come out of the structures themselves and get sucked up, say back into a portal in the sky or something. So a lot of great work has already been done, and good work has been done through the time travel program. It wasn't all bad. But Jesus Christ is the one who himself is going to have the strength to put away evil for good. When the sword comes out of his mouth to destroy the hybrid dragon kings for good, and then we come in, and we came in at many times, and much of his elect, much of his end times army, much of his bride, his chosen ones, to lay that groundwork with many others coming together to be unified in the body of Christ, so that his feet can come here again at the right time, touch the earth again at Mount Olives, and bring the earth to its knees, and that heavenly authority can be the authority that's on earth, and not whose hands it is in right now. The God of this world is still Hasatan. So we saw angelic dispositions, dispositions, came face to face with highest fallen angels that had 4 faces too, their ranks, so that we could become equipped and qualified to draw closer to the will of Yah and make his enemies our eternal enemies. So we had to fight the old ones to be competent and confident enough to be able to stand with an end times army and their ranks then we could have a summation of all of our experiences, basically viewed from like very old biblical times to these modern times, and then be brought to the forefront as forerunners, being unlocked at random intervals, to be able to not have fear. Because if you've seen giants, if you have seen fallen angels, if you have seen the deepest of our fears that would cause our hearts to fail and our psyches, if we're not prepared and calibrated enough, then we're not going to be afraid of that last serpent, which will be dealt with, which is Leviathan. So we lost parts of ourselves in the annals of time, but that was a way to preserve our heritage and our inheritance and keep the enemy from infiltrating and having any advantage to prior tactics and skills that we had already used or tucked away, or that God had secretly concealed to be hidden from the enemy's eyes, and those histories of accomplished feats that we had already walked over. We rotated into spiritual realms, navigating ourselves more proficiently and efficiently at each decade and turn of the century guideposts. Out of the shadows each time and into the light. So QAnon is like 100-year-old blueprint and work and dream, work in the making, for people to take a stand and choose the right, and to be able to have the awareness brought to a collective conscious level where it's safe, or where people don't freak out and try to kill and attack on a mass level the ones that are trying to bring about the highest truths to the scene. Because those people that are unconscious are operating from like an unconscious animal standpoint still, and they don't know the forces that are still tethered, working through them. Because if you're not translated into the book of life, you're not saved and operating in the authority of the kingdom of heaven, the Lord literally considers those people as dead, as walking dead men among us. So it's even a battle before the resurrection of the righteous, the just, and the damned, and the dead, between the dead and the living that are already here, and the various types of humans and human hybrids that have been here since the garden times. So we could only hope to continue to lay the groundwork, and that the bride who really desire to know all of the fullness of the gospel, we just pray that they will all continue to come together so that we can be ready for the Messianic era, to be worthy of the embrace of the King of Kings when he comes to the earth, and be a living sacrifice in the meantime, so that we'll be able to see his hand move for us, towards us, for us, and not be against us, and take his hand and be led into the truth of all things on a daily level. And to also, in the meantime, just anticipate his spirit breathing new life into us, and for his soul to encompass us in the end, to take us home. So the soul splicing and other types of techniques that they did, I can testify firsthand, soul shunting you, or whatever you want to call it, trying to erase God out of your life, your consciousness, and things that are encoded into you and your relationships, that can all be mended and healed. There's nothing that is impossible with God. So a lot of the current secret space program narratives and disclosure are still being run by operatives that are fortunately they're still programmed. They're not really deprogrammed yet. And then they mix disinfo about these breakaway civilizations and, like I said, the safety zones before, which are just feasting zones to feed off humans, mixing truth with lies still. So you have to look at it from this type of information from the filter of the Holy Spirit, the mind of Christ, what's really out there. From the standpoint of the war in heaven, how it came to earth. Like, if you want to know something about the universe and how it operates, why not ask the creator of the universe himself? That just makes more sense. What's still going on interdimensionally with all of it and all of us. And then most of all, what are you going to do about it? How can you get yourself out of the way? Let the Lord show you what really is, so that you can see through that glass more clearly, and then see him one day fully face to face, which means in the full presence, without the need for these veils and filters so much anymore that we have to operate through here, but it's for our own safety because we can't experience the fullness of heavenly presences because we would spontaneously combust. So the angel showed us things too, like different apertures in time, like buffer zones, like a golden fleece that would allow like a time slit slice of heaven window doorway to kind of open up outside the visibility of, say, like the solar warden spacecraft or human technology, so that they could not track us, and so that we could have this little space, the secret space with God, so we could be shown higher truths, have ministering to us, because angels do minister to people every day. And they are on mission, they rescue, uh, because the Lord wants to preserve a lot of his children. He wants the best interest for a lot of those kids that were abducted from Montauk, taken onto spaceships. He has a better plan and hope for them. He had a better plan for me and hope for me, and he showed that to me if I was willing to receive it and if I chose him, which I did. So a lot of these kids that survived, they had a higher calling in their life. They had a commission to go that extra line behind the enemy's lines and stay there for God's purposes, behind that wall of time, to see the end point and then his hand over all of it. Those kids will receive the crown of life. And what we'd see in some of those windows where we had angelic communication was like this warm blanketing glory wave light that would open up these little windows and peeks into the real heavenly kingdom that Yahushua speaks of, that's not of this world, and that his eyes lit up with when he talked about his Father's kingdom. And that is the glory, when we go glory to glory to glory, that we fall short of every day here, because we have to lay down our flesh and crucify our flesh every day here. So when we had those moments, those enchantments and veneers of things and bouts of confusion were taken away. They were just kind of stripped away, because the Lord comes in and he literally breaks the yoke off of your neck, of anything, off of your shoulders, takes you out of the devil's hands, and says he'll never be able to take you out of my hands now, as a transference of authorities in the spiritual realms of warfare. Those bonds and bands of slavery just are unshackled. They come off. And when you lay everything down at the cross, that's what happens. And then you become clean of all of the defilements, no matter how deep they go, because there's no grave that he can't go into. There's nothing deep enough that the Messiah can't reach. So we learn how to bypass like technological array systems, energy signature trackings, going forward and backwards in time, staying in the present without decoupling ourselves entirely, having like spirit visits, spirit visions, traveling in the spirit, how to beat the Space Force systems that were set up, their ships, how the ships operated and navigated, their controls, and the controllers of them. Like I said, one of the worst things I saw was the black type of blood or biomaterial that was coming out of a console on a ship, because they do use biomaterial and organic computer systems up there. That's how the beast, part of the beast system and computers operate. So we had divine appointments in secret places, despite the things that were going on in the secret space program. So there is a space-time continuum still, many different things riding on those carrier frequency waves in this world and other worlds above our heads daily that people don't really think too much about. We saw serpents of old, dragons, the dragon of Apophis, portals opened up through the spacecrafts and technology, antediluvian things, playing kids like toy soldiers with one another, trying to just bring back the Demiurge system back here on Earth, and anchor points through Masonic grid laying, multiple overlay systems, navigations, energy spectrums. But you could feel an advent or an event before it would happen. And it's like synthetic realms kind of couple together and intermix with the 3D in this sort of veil overlay system. And it's a very friction type of thing. It's like a grating motion against your soul because it's unnatural. And many things have been opened up here on Earth that should not have been opened up. And so now they have to rely on CERN and other types of things in modern day technology because a lot of the old world systems are done away with and obsolete and taken off world. AI can't go before the Lord's timing. It can't create its own reality here. It wasn't allowed to happen. Okay, so I talked about mind corruption on stage, theater type mind control before Hollywood came into existence. The Hollywood clones, their open-ended soul matrix, hollowed out system they use, and what happened before Hollywood was experiments basically with what would work, what wouldn't work with different types of early 1900s clones and sound systems and frequency control because Hasatan was the angel of the cherub of the choir. So that's his main go to, the blue beam and the frequency control. So what they would use back then is not so much the multiple layered HD frequencies that can come out of a TV or harp or all the different modalities that they use today. What they used was just old theater systems and trance-like states like pocket watches, different things like that, and then the old mighty Wurlitzer organ systems. And then the people, the entities that would body jump and had tech in their heads could kind of like amp up like a psi frequency or something that would make the whole theater shake and the walls shake with the Wurlitzer organs. And it would make the people who were already pre-programmed to the different types of frequencies be in a trance-like state before that they would participate in these plays, in these like rites and rituals that would actually be actively displayed in these old types of vaudeville theater type systems. So those were many attempts. In a lot of theaters got just completely destroyed and fights happening in them because they used the old theater systems just like the mansion rings still to traffic kids and have secret doors and compartments. They had girls in different theater rooms upstairs and other things, and mind control slaves. Basically, a lot of these old-fashioned theater systems in the times of the silent film eras. So at one of these theaters, I ended up actually breaking free from trance, and I hated the sound of the Wurlitzer organ, which they also used in the movie Interstellar, of course, and ended up fighting with the shapeshifter guy that was on the organ because they would prop up the organ like it was just on a pedestal, like it was a god to them, and it had red velvet black curtains all over it and everything, and ended up pushing him off of the bench and fighting with him so that there was no more frequency control, and me and the group I was with would snap out of it then. So it was almost like the devil himself was sitting there at the Wurlitzer organ at one time. It was quite the scene. We visited many minefields too, chat piles, other things like that. There was a lot of covert activity at some of these places and infestation areas of reptilians at those places too. One had a train that was called the Electric Hearse, and that train was outfitted with tech and went back and forth in time. And we saw like bandit killings and different things. And then in those chat piles, sometimes would be uh, battle battlefield remnants. I'll just say evidence of some of these like interdimensional warfare, and bodies would be in those chat piles because cave systems and other things like that at certain time periods were like infested with interdimensionals sometimes, and they had to be dealt with. We had a lot of forced fights in water and different types of spring areas, and actually had to like capture different types of cave creatures sometimes. One of them had like black spots on its face, and then we had to fight these things in water sometimes and with fire. And some of them had black fire to them, a black fire element. And then we would have to contain them, capture, contain them, and then put them into these like steel, kind of like a submarine has one of those doors that open up. In the water, there would be stationed something like that. So then you'd have to not only fight monstrous things in the water without having your neck broke or something and spiral and spin in the water and know how to do that efficiently, effectively. Usually you had like a little mouthpiece that would have oxygen in it so you could breathe more underwater while doing this. And then you'd have to put that creature, that being from the cave inside, open that steel door into that steel containment unit. So sometimes they made us capture some of these things too. Very horrible things they did. And I'm thinking like at the time, like why couldn't you guys just like take a net, get these things yourself? Why are you putting us through all this unnecessary hell? I didn't understand a lot of things. So we saw a lot of gross, dim darkness. A lot of gross darkness in Hannibal, Missouri, with the cannibals there. That was lifted after we left. We did see certain places get transformed too. King Louis Basilica in St. Louis was a huge place for an experiment that happened there, and teleportation devices, and St. Peter's Basilica that's in the area too, sitting right underneath the St. Louis Archway, which is also a relic of a old Stargate failed attempt that had to do with France and America and troops trying to be sent through a larger type of Stargate and taking over certain geographical areas. A lot of internal wars we had seen going on, corrupted timelines with devastating consequences, but many things that were also stopped too and halted in between sequences and start and stop points. We got to see the real Sherlock Holmes, different types of photo vaults, and get to document and lay out certain photos and things that we had mapped out to be brought out at a later time. Ebbets Field House was a very haunted place full of sorcery too. And the Campbell House in St. Louis, very haunted, very vampiric place, connected to other vampiric graveyards of their leaders. Places like Tower Grove, Shaw, different history than what's presented there. We saw mirror magic, body swapping, the Eagle Eye Pacific style outfitted time trek trains, mind wipes happening in train rooms, hyper tech jump trains. The weirdest thing that I probably saw back then was also how they experimented with trying to transfer consciousness through waves into chimpanzees from human subjects. And that was really hard to watch because at certain points, these old men were actually carrying around chimpanzees when they had success with some of these types of Nazi Frankenstein sciences and bringing them to theaters on chains, like on leashes. And people had no idea what was going on. And the cruelty that happened with experimenting with consciousness transfer on chimpanzees at first and trying to kind of imprison somebody. So then they'd set up these cute apartment rooms in the zoo and stuff and pretend like they were doing research on these chimpanzees. But it was all about the cloning and the consciousness transfer and the beginnings of all of that. Remote areas, abandoned areas were also part of Ghost Recon, as I mentioned before, places on the Buffalo River, Abraham Villines, little cemeteries, things like that, where there were gruesome activities going on at earlier time periods that were covered up, or caves that the hybrid fire yetis would crawl out of at night that were used against us. The caves like that are just blocks sealed off now with steel bars, and nobody knows anything about them. Nobody can enter the area. There's not even a sign in a lot of these places that you encounter out in the middle of nowhere like that. So we had to be on guard, because if we were in the Boxley area, the Buffalo River, or the Narge, Skull Bluff, places like that at night, way before it was more publicly even known, we had no idea what was going to come out of these abandoned buildings at night, or what we were going to encounter and confront. And sometimes a child in these encounters could not get help. So you would be just by yourself up against, the group would have to watch you, and you'd have to carry out and execute the assignment and be successful. So, in a summation, these are some of the experiences of Rose Tider. Okay, we saw also many things in Springs. Mark Twain's Forest, of course. He said, man's never the same after he goes into a river twice, and that river is never the same. So we soon found this to be true, especially in the time travel program. And trying to go back and map out all these areas, all these remote places, all these rivers, keeping track of all of it, was just insane. Different necks of the woods, different markers. We brought to one place, it was called the Deep Mysterious Blue Hole. They were telling us that it went on forever. We had to do what they said that day, otherwise they'd throw us in there. And it was like called the Gulf Hole at the time, because it was a geological anomaly, and these instruments were lost when they were thrown into this blue hole, and then they popped back out on the Gulf Coast. So thank God that I had the gift of discernment still with me at the time, even in my amnesia, because I would look at their eyes, I would look at their faces, their hand gestures, read their body, their expressions. I could tell if they were lying or not, even if they tried not to smile or look at each other. So I'm like, they're lying. We then at that day we refused to listen to what they were going to do, because they would just take us to these random places in the middle of nowhere and say, oh, we're going to threaten to throw you in here, and like you'll be lost if you don't do this or that. So we resisted a lot of things too. Some of the deeper waters we saw were in the Palm de Terre, deep blue mining waters in Missouri, and you actually needed gear to go down into there too. And some of the waters are very caustic, and they're full of like lead and iron filaments and other things that you have to protect yourself against, from copper. You can get copper poisoning from some of these places, and there's a lot of deep caves, and over 600 documented in the Ozark, but there's a lot more than that aren't documented. And in that place they had pillars cut out, and they were very beautiful down there actually, but that was kind of like a foreshadow and a prelude to what was in uh, bigger mission fields like Kazakhstan, and other water bases, sea bases like that. We also saw like the beginnings of bridges, things in like 1929, these two old stone castle houses that people lived in on the bendy 20-degree curved bridge around the chain of lakes near St. Louis. And that was a very powerful experience, being stuck out there for days, wrestling with metal tools in our hands with these like reprobate men that were like turned reptilian, that were trying to screw up like the water currents and flow at the time. And I've never in my life been so close to feeling the power of water that was there at that time. And it just reminded me of the power of the ocean tides and how they pull things, because it is the mighty Mississippi in certain strong spots, and it should not be taken lightly. And then we were also taking other bridges like the Catoosa Whale Baby Crybaby Bridge, and that was not a normal bridge, because the reptilians would play like this sick game with people out there at night, and they'd like shapeshift as different things, and would chase like a woman with a baby off the bridge even, and then try to put us as like monkey in the middle and have us like try to catch the baby underneath the bridge or something. Now this name got affiliated, associated with other haunted bridges. There's a bridge in Tennessee and other places, several other ones that opened up a window in time to label them the crybaby bridges. Once again, people have no idea what these histories are of a lot of these places and a lot of these hauntings because our history has been so monkeyed around with. And there's a lot of backstories to many of these so-called haunted, derelict, abandoned places that look like World War II hit them. And on Route 66, Ribbon Road, the Hooker's Cut area, um, Stony Dell, Stony Hell, lots of travesties like that. The Trail of Tears that went through Stony Hell, and why Mark Twain's statue is just ungodly sitting there. People don't need to question these things, this weirdness that's just randomly displayed everywhere. That doesn't make any sense. So a lot of the roads, a lot of the train tracks, a lot of the old brick roads and stuff, even on the old Route 66, just kind of disappear into the woods somewhere sometimes, or grassy areas, or other roads that just kind of swallow them up like a relic of the past, soon to be buried and forgotten about. So it was important to document a lot of these things and have it come out kind of around the time periods of 2016 until now, which will continue at a fast-paced rate until about 2025. Bella Vista also had an area where there was high trafficking too, and other wars with other certain types of old-fashioned hotels. And they made a lot of video games and horror movies from a lot of these old ghost towns. And barn buildings, Shiloh and Springdale, Arkansas, and other places like that that are highly satanically, ritualistically used places. And the Welch Hospital that was out in the middle of nowhere, which had a lot of supernatural activity and openings in that area too, that they brought us to at a few different times. And the water is toxic. It was toxic at the time to swim through. So many people were put there in the middle of the woods in this Welch Asylum, and it was a flooding current that they make us go through. And we've seen like bloody reptilians in there with bodies. The place was very haunted looking. There's cement slabs in there that are shaped like an L figure, and the entire structure is just barely still there. It's very bizarre. Um, it wasn't a healing hospital. It was more like where people would go that had mental illness that were sent there in the middle of the woods, the middle of nowhere. So it's extremely haunted, just like Ironton, Missouri, St. Mary's Hospital, and the other St. Mary's that had smallpox in St. Louis. Many places are connected. One other place I will mention is Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Walnut was also a trigger for a lot of kids, PTSD, like Walnut Shade, Walnut Grove type cities like that. But the whole thing with Laura Ingalls Wilder, and why I give props and I'm very thankful for Arizona Wilder's story and Nathan Wilder's story, is because there is a MK background to that beginning of Laura Ingalls Wilder, the Wilder ones family, where there was some cult activity, there was some SRA back then. We got to see back in time at various points things that took place there, and why it's so like Disney associated in the markers that are there. It's a fairy tale. The Sleepy Eye Minnesota town triggered PTSD in us because that town was the basis for some experiments with kids with the high tech they were using, and the basis of the Freddy Krueger story about don't fall asleep, because this town had pictures of like old Chief Sleepy Eyes, and you did not want to fall asleep. And that was one of the things that you didn't want to do there, because you would fear like being left there, like in a clone body, and not being able to survive there in winter or something. This is out in the middle of nowhere. And then they recreated the whole scene somewhere out in California with these bigger hills out in the middle of nowhere on a long dirt road. And then the entire set ended up getting destroyed and taken down. Okay, so sometimes kids as a group would be left in places like that to deal with certain nightmarish towns and sociopathic backwoods things that were going on there. So you'd have to like remember the mission there and remember certain guideposts, um, so that you would be conscious enough to remember certain signs, guideposts like that to find your way back into the real world and grounding it away from the sociopathic experimentation. So I hope many people, like Nathan and Arizona Wilder, would continue to come out with their testimonies in this time and have safe disclosure in this window of opportunity to do so. Because, like, as long as Trump remains president, because him and Barron were also part of the time travel program, there is safety in numbers and safety in queue, is safety for thousands of us to gather right now. That's never happened before in history, to have demonstrations, rallies, disclosure conferences, conventions, public speaking forums for the exposure of the deep state and other elements that tie into that. Supernatural anomalies, secret access programs, secret space program, unacknowledged secret access program. Even though it's still a regulated disclosure and not all of it can come out at once, it's happening at an integrated and exponential level still to assist humanity to overturn the powers that be. And it's still um, a secret war, but it will become a spoken war in the media and public domain soon and not be considered just a conspiracy theory. So we still have to be careful who we can trust, who we can talk to, but God willing, we can make the strides and leaps and bounds in this great work and awakening to continue to be rolled out. That I can promise you. The unconscious people, like I said, who have this knee-jerk reaction to these things, those are the dangerous ones because they're not aware of what's working through them, trying to hurt others who are trying to speak truth, and they're acting blindly, and they don't care about who they pursue, stalk, or hurt. And that's still actually a big percentage of our populace, unfortunately, because these are people that have no shield, no spiritual covering from on high. They aren't sealed for the end times, and so they're going to continue to be used by the dark factions. They're going to be catalysts for that vein of chaos to work through them, to work against us. They're the open targets, and they inflict others. So we're going to see an increase in the sleeper cells coming out. But the children of light have to raise up a standard of righteousness against that. They have to have face-to-face confrontations with that and not back down, and to have confidence and bravery and combat all of this eventually, whether it's in their personal lives or in the public sectors, in any way that they would be ridiculed or how they would have to defend themselves and truth. The evidence that's being brought forth against the kingdom of darkness is continuing to paramount as every rock and stone will be turned over and everything brought into the light. So we continue to pray against the kingdom of darkness daily, and that's the big, big, big thing. Because so many of these things are going to be such an eyesore, like the visual display of that mountain of rotting filth on the news and skeletons coming out from underneath places and all that filth coming out for the cleansing process and the birth pains that Earth's going to have to go through. It'll be shown in the media and on such a more large scale level and made evident in our own little towns and communities when we talk to people about this, that no one's going to be able to deny that the mystery of iniquities is a major force to be dealt with and contended with still. They won't be able to deny it any longer, and that will shift humanity into a state of having to choose good or evil and what side they're on ultimately, and they can't be on the fence anymore because it'll be made fact and it'll be recorded in Earth's history books of the present, and not just like some mythological or campfire stories of ancient past that gets passed down from generation to generation. So we'll be seeing this rising up of a godly generation spearheading these things, putting spearheads into the camp of the enemy because holy armies will surround them with holy fire. This generation springing up, it'll be gathering in various places of the world. There will be cities of refuge and light, like portals of light, safety and stability, um, like light families, and for sustainability purposes. There'll be modern day type Moseses, living gateways of people. But on the flip side and scale of that, there'll also be evil spirits driven out of those places because they can't exist there. They can't stay in that presence of holiness, and they're going to go into more metropolitan areas to take over those. And those cities will either be having like a banner of Holy Spirit on them and protection, or certain cities will be handed over to the strong delusion full of reprobates and become those void spaces and places where there is no Holy Spirit. And those are cities that you would not want to enter into, like Mad Max. So Rose Wilder, she has a modern day clone. We saw different types of characters in the Wilder family get replaced, and the story changed through history into being made into one big happy family. It had programming because even when I was a kid, I would have a bonnet on my head. I would sit and listen and watch the stories of Little House on the Prairie on the TV. Interdimensionals were playing games with this for a while with kids in the 80s. Those 80s kids, the Stranger Things kids. I will tell you that. And I would get triggered watching that show, and then sometimes also break programming from watching Little House on the Prairie. The music, when Laura Ingalls sometimes came back down the hill on the credits, sometimes there would be like an AI insert there, and there would be a black X right over her face sometimes. And then I would kind of like take my bonnet off and snap out of it, like, I don't even like this show. Why am I even watching it, you know? So that place was documented. A lot of places that carried a lot of disdain, and places where there was a lot of abandonment and just a lot of weirdness happened. Those places should just be taken off the map, like Piker, Oklahoma. Piker, Oklahoma was one place that looked like just like Hiroshima had hit it. A lot of things went on there too, and that's when nobody goes there. There were some peaceful moments at the end of the Time Wars, though, um, that were in nature. Many rivers, many waterfalls, um, certain caves that had actual good associations connected to them. So I can say that not every place, you know, in the Ozarks that we were taken to had bad connotations. Some of them actually had healing benefits, and you could just listen to the sound of the waterfall, have release and moments of clarity and communications with God in some of those times. Because light would come through some of the rocks, and if you felt in the shifting of all these various places we were taken to, like a chaos or like a feeling like I can't go on anymore or do this, sometimes you would see light come through like a rock, and you could actually go out there and pray and just be all by yourself, um, with just barely any sounds out there, and have very clear moments of consciousness where you could understand who you were and what had happened to you and what you were doing out there. So, as I stated before, they had the ability to clone parts of us, binary codes, put into supercomputers. They can replicate false futures. They give you artificial timelines, but you can speak over those artificial timelines and collapse them all, because they are just doing witchcraft to try to project a false future onto you that doesn't even have to be anchored here to manifest. So they manipulate digitized parts, can clone different parts, digitalizations, kind of holograms of our spirit or soul, but it's not the real thing. They deal in the cloning realm, technology, frequency manipulation spectrum, lower vibrations, holographic realms, because that's all they have. And we have the power to cancel all of that out and all of that negative evil and purge it out and just have one concurrent, distinct timeline that is in the highest alignment with the will that God has over our own lives, and speak that into existence over that. And then those assignments from the evil one, the marine kingdom, and from all of that will be buried, that will be pushed back, and it'll all be broken off. So we can bury those false futures, especially when we come into baptism, and then we rise with the blessed hope and that hope of glory in the head of the second Adam, which is Jesus Christ, the resurrection of the righteous. Because with the interdimensional time wars, they kind of wanted to bury you with them in time torture techniques and clone body torture techniques, tactics like that, that is all recorded and written in the book of the damned, and what they do against the children of man and against the children of God. So God turned the tables around many times, and then even placed like churches in several of these black site areas that were made deplorable, made into something good for his purposes. There's also like certain future. There's a future training center that happened too with the best industry and leadership and education that happened where the Voisier's mansion used to be near St. Louis and other places like that where we had um, the V mansion difficult times with in the V theaters and other things when they had the movie V come out also in the 80s, which was about the Anunnaki that we had dealt with at Montauk, whose ship left the woods there. They also controlled back in the time certain fire stations by V ringleaders. But our soul is seated, the soul is seated in the mind, the seat of our consciousness. So when we understand this, how to heal our own minds and stuff, then a lot of those things can get overwritten. It's just when we first started coming into all these things and got pulled through so many different parts of it and stringlined through it, we didn't understand how a lot of times they were operating and doing these things, which can be partially explained in a scientific way. But of course, there's also a spiritual component to all of these things. But above it all, your imagination has to be sanctified and washed clean, and your thoughts filtered um, to be able to see through what the minds of the programmers were doing and how to beat them at their own game. So it's kind of like we saw into how to maintaining memories, how to see into like a quadratic soul equation. Because there are missions here at these end times that aren't your normal types of soul missions. Most humans do come here on Earth and they do die, live here once, like blades of grass. But there are missions here from heaven to edify the elect, to gather the elect from the four corners of the earth, to prevent the enemy from going before God's timing, and to deal with certain of these things that most humans don't ever have to deal with. And it's all to bring glory and honor back to Him to fulfill His word. We also saw like how in certain families they had already tried to birth an antichrist in certain time periods, and how that got halted because once again they always want to like pick a baby that's going to be born and then um, go before the timing because the enemy tries to change times and change times and time and time. So that was interesting to see too, and how certain churches were used to try to program like a child that they wanted to to grow up to like either birth the antichrist or become the antichrist. We saw a lot of dragon type women, dragon ladies, things like that would always show up in the same type of places too. Train stations, we'd see interdimensionals waiting for you to get off at certain train stations too, and possessions that would happen there. Uh, like somebody holding a black umbrella or something. The black umbrella was heavily used and in MK Ultra Umbrella program later on and in the Umbrella Academy for these reasons. Because of certain fights we would have with the imagery of like somebody standing there with an umbrella or statues at um, the West Estates on Long Island with statues holding umbrellas, things like that, with black masks over their faces. Westbury Estates. And then the train stations also have a connotation with how steampunk romance was birthed because nobody still really knows like where that originated from, and like it's still just kind of like a dying trend that doesn't make much sense. So we saw how spiritual warfare operated, who was opening stargates, using different types of tech and cloaking, um, and and holding body forms with tech too, and belts and other things they use, like the queen, portals, letting the dogs in, etc. It kind of felt like we were parts at times through it all, like pieces that were boxed up and taken out at a later time to be picked up and messed with, and then like have to choose an unfair choice because of this like perpetual ultimatum that we're always paired against. So at the end of a lot of the train station fightings and stuff, and always like being transferred and transported from like trains, vehicles, and other things, and even planes sometimes. They had me and John pose in these clothes that kicked off that steampunk trend that nobody really still seems to understand. That's kind of frizzled and frazzled out. I had a clock on my skirt once, and then John had this fluffy shirt on at the end of the train wars, and those just insurmountable, ridiculous amounts of jumping with the train stations. A lot of them are ghost stations now, and we're at the tail end of certain things. There was a lot of waiting that happened at train stations and private rooms you just go up and be left at for like maybe a couple days on end or a weekend. There's also a door at a federal building that was a hidden door that would open up. Sometimes clone body transfers would happen there too. The Palace of Industries in St. Louis was a big spiritual fight that happened there too. With modern times, you had the um, different types of groups that would meet together. Back then, you didn't. You just had like the big dragon family. People just all come together, and they'd wear like Victorian clothing, and they thought they were just like running the best of like the satanic economy. Um, so we, in the spirit, saw these dragons battling and fighting over the scenery and the marble structures, the stone floors, and a lot of things we saw happen at the Palace of Industries. There was like the Palace of Warehouses, the Palace of this and that. It was like a Vienna type ride there. You have to ride in a little boat to get up there. And then the world's richest people would gather there. And that was at times when they were actually still having that type of slavery system. Um, so we saw an end to some of that too at the Palace of Industries. At the end of all this, too, well, not the end, at one point near the end, Casbolt started calling himself a time agent. There was paintings actually done of us in certain like cafe diners where a man in a suit and hat would take a picture of us outside. Me, Cass, and John sitting inside of, say, like a cafe. And then there's a painter named Hopper that painted a couple pictures of us in the theater and sitting at like an old school type of cafe. The last thing I'll end up with is Frank Lloyd Wright, Getty connection. There was a whole thing with that, and them actually having like Illuminati coveted old creatures that would like live in caves and stuff, like a Patagonian monster or something that looked like a Sukhoth or something. They would have some of these things as pets. And Frank Lloyd Wright, Getty, I can verify were time terrorists themselves, working together, having an underground labyrinth. Getty's son was tortured and mutilated by a draconian faction because he was going to leave that type of lifestyle and go against his father. So that was very heartbreaking to watch. Frank Lloyd Wright has about a 30-foot tall statue of a black pan in the Talesian house. Many axe murders, fires, and brutal murders happened in a lot of these sites and houses that they had together, which was also part of the connection with Anubis occulus, which had lion men hybrids in the tunnel system underneath there that we also had to battle and confront, that were activated by certain scripts written on pillars and a bowl of black nanotech that they ingested to become like these animated, almost type like robotically programmed lion men of Moab. And the names associations are just so crazy because that's actually in Damascus, Oregon. So we saw the shutdown of that whole system too. And Getty, I believe, will be overturned in its evidence and tunnels that hold a lot of evidence from things that were transported underneath it and the beginnings and makings of it. Frank Lloyd Wright called himself like the builder of America, but he was into SRA and into a lot of covert things and would randomly appear with his cane. Those two guys always carried the scepters, which the old men of these certain types of clubs and organizations always carried as symbols of status. They never smiled. They were the most miserable men you could find on the face of the earth. And Frank Lloyd Wright would make the designs and build certain symbols and things into the house structures. They're very dark, very dead energy built into all of his types of artwork and housing structures built for the very purpose of just creating the buildings to be used as ritual sites. So, on that note, I will leave it off. Those are the adventures of Rose Tider. Sayonara.